Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Romans chapter 2. Romans is in the New Testament. If you're still learning your way around the Bible, know that there's an Old Testament and a New Testament. The Old Testament starts with Genesis. It's like before the birth of Jesus. The New Testament starts with Matthew. It's from the birth of Jesus on. Romans is in the New Testament. So there's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and Romans. It's the sixth book of the New Testament. We've been talking about patience. One of our desires is to disciple people. You know, a win for us is to introduce people to a real relationship with Jesus. We want to connect them with a life group because we believe that in life groups where real change takes place as we journey together, because we're not here to see through you, but to see you through. And then also to help people discover their gifts so they can find out why they're here and their gifts and use them so they can serve and change their world. And so, one of the ways we disciple you too is we have devotions that we give out to you every week. So if you came in, you got to worship God and also a devotional that'll go through 5 days. We encourage you to get those and read those and look at it. We've been talking about patience. How many of you have been patiently waiting for this series to get over with? All right, yeah. First week, man, we talked about being patient in the hard times, be patient in trouble, patient in difficult times. And the next week, we talked about being patient, waiting on what God had spoken to us, for those things to come to pass, for us to be able to see those things take place. That sometimes some of you have been waiting for weeks, for months, for years, for decades, for things that God has spoken to your heart, to see those begin to manifest and take place. And then last week, the most fun week of all, we talked about being patient with each other. How many of you have had an opportunity to be patient with another human being this week? Have you had those words ring out, be patient with difficult people? Let me see your hand. How many of you are sitting next to one of those people that have given you an opportunity? Yeah, that's what I thought. And I think if some of you weren't afraid, there'd have been a lot more hands raised, right? So, man, just this week, and I'm just driving, and people are it's almost like there's just like this meeting that's like, this dude's talking about patience. Let's really put him to the test this week. It's thing after thing. So it's been one of those weeks, but, this is a good series for us to grow. I want to talk to you this morning about the patience of God. And God is patient. I'm just so grateful that He's patient, aren't you? And so He's very patient with our lives. So let's look at Romans chapter 2. And Romans was a letter that a guy named Paul wrote to a bunch of Christians. So it's written to us. And so in Romans chapter 2, verse 1, he said, "You may think you can condemn such people, but you're just as bad. And you have no excuse when you say they are wicked and should be punished. You're condemning yourself. For you who judge others do these very same things. And we know that God, in His justice, will punish anyone who does such things. Since you judge others for doing these things, why do you think you can avoid God's judgment when you do the same things? Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient?" Everybody say patient. Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you, with me? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that His kindness is intended to turn you from your sin? So God is kind. He's patient. Now, he starts out here and if you look in chapter 1 at the end of it, he's talking about all these different sins, but he confronts the people of God, and he says, look, you're judging them for these things. And he said, you're guilty of the same thing in some way, form, or fashion. You're guilty of the same way. And so he said, you have to be reminded, that God's patient. I want to show you a picture here. This is one of my favorite verses. That right there is my oldest grandson. That's Eli. Isn't he a good-looking kid? And so his, Jake and Ashley, Jake is the guy that leads worship. That's his son. Thank goodness Eli didn't look a thing like him. And so here's the thing. Yeah, anyway. So he's just so much fun. He's such a good boy. I was over at their house the other day, and they have 4 kids. And, he's the oldest, and he's 6. So, there's a lot of activity taking place in there. You're just trying to control the circus. And so they're getting ready to eat. And I remember that they were sitting around the table, and he said something, and I thought, this is just such a 6-year-old thing. One of his siblings had like a sippy cup or a cup with a lid, and he goes, "I don't use baby cups anymore." And so that's right. I don't use baby cups anymore. I used to have baby cups. I don't use baby cups. Kind of giving him a hard time because he doesn't use baby cups. And I thought, man, that is such a picture of who we can be as Christians, is sometimes we forget where we came from. We forget how God's been patient with us and how He's grown us. And so many times, we have to be reminded that just like God is patient with me, He's patient with them. And He's called me to be patient, that it's His kindness, that it's His patience. That's one of the things that causes Him that causes us to turn our hearts towards him. I've said this before, and I don't say it as a cliche. I genuinely, sincerely mean this, that I'm grateful for God's patience. To be real transparent with you, I've said it, I genuinely mean this. If I were God, I would have already told me, dude, you got to go. I mean, you can't be a pastor anymore. I mean, I'll see you when you get to heaven. Good luck with that. But I mean, you can't be, because I just know me. I know what I've done. I know who I am. I know what I'm capable of. I know what my past looks like. I know how I can become if I get selfish or under pressure. Or I don't get my way, just the things that I'm tempted with, I struggle with. But God's been patient with me. I'm so grateful for his patience, aren't you? You're just so patient. And so it says this, that can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your sin? That one of the reasons why he's kind with us, one of the reasons why he's patient with us, is so that we'll change. So that I'll recognize that, like, man, he's so good to me. That why would I not want to change? Why would I not want to do different? Now, I've shared this story before, but it fits in this moment. And it is a reality. I know people raise kids differently. People parent differently. And I know you love your kids. And so, this is not an indictment on anybody. All I can tell you is how I was raised. And, the Bible says that, somebody that spares the rod hates their kids. Let me tell you something. My parents love me. And so, thank you. They love me often. And so I can remember, doing things and corporal punishment, spanking, whatever you want to call it, would take place. And it was never a pleasant time. It wasn't one of those things where I'm like, hey, can we schedule another one of those tomorrow? I mean, it was, and I've often said, the dumbest question we parents ask, like, do you want a spanking? So what are you going to say to that? Well, you better say no. But sometimes the sarcastic side was like, is it multiple choice? So those were one of those things I didn't like. But I will tell you this much, that there were times that when I would do something and the depth of it, would just affect my mom in such a way that she wanted to spank me, man, she'd start crying. And it had such an impact on me because in that moment, I recognized just that I hadn't just been a knucklehead, that something I'd done had affected her heart. And that she was revealing just her disappointment, her brokenness, just how this had impacted her. And that was sometimes that was far more impacting than that spanking was. Now, don't get me wrong, man, those things were they learned me. And so, but just those moments where I'm like, can't you just spank me? It's what, because it just this thing in her. And I think sometimes we really genuinely encounter the kindness of God and the goodness of God. That there's something in that causes me to say, I don't want to do this because it's going to make you angry. I don't want to do this because you love me and I want to break your heart. In Genesis, I think it's Genesis 6, when God's looking over all of the earth, just before he gets ready to talk to Noah, one of the things he says it's something along these lines. He says, he saw all the evilness that was in humanity and that they'd only desired to do only evil. And it said it broke his heart that he had made them. It's because he saw how they treated each other and what they did to each other. There's something about encountering the patience of God, the goodness of God, that at some point causes me to say, Lord, you love me in a way I don't understand. You love me in a way I don't fully get, but I see that you're not indifferent to my sin, and it's not that you're always mad at me when I blow it. It's just that you love me and you know the damage that this does to my life. And so I don't want to do it not because I'm afraid of you. I don't want to do it because I see how much you love me. I want to change my life as a result of that. When you truly encounter the goodness of God and you surrender and you recognize it, and it just impacts you to realize how undeserving that goodness is in my life. That God uses me and he calls me not because I'm good enough, not because I merit it, but just because he's good. And then when everybody else would disqualify, when I would even disqualify myself, that his patience goes a step further and goes, I'm not ready to give up on you yet. And it makes me want to change. It makes me want to change. God's patience convicts us to change. It convicts me to do better, right? Doesn't it convict you when you encounter his goodness and you just realize, man, I've blown it again, and yet I still feel your heart dealing with me. I still sense that you're challenging me and that you're showing up and you're speaking to me, that you haven't given up on me. And that other people left my life when I blew that again, but you were still there pursuing me, visiting me, the voice of God speaking to me in my thoughts, in my heart, in my actions, that just this awareness that just all of a sudden I would just know that you were dealing with me again. That there's something about that caused me to want to do better, to want to make better decisions and better choices, because he's been so patient with me. I don't know about you, but when I tell the truth about who I am, when I tell the truth about what I've done and who I've hurt and what I'm capable of on my worst day, and the one that knows me better than even I know myself still loves me, it makes me want to do better. It makes me want to do right. Number one is this, is that God's patience convicts us to change. Look at number two, if you would go with me to Revelation chapter 2. Revelation is the last book in the Bible. And I know sometimes we start talking about the book of Revelation, some people get really excited, some people get real scared, like, oh my gosh, are we going to talk about, things being on fire and stuff like that? But we'll do that next Sunday. Revelation chapter 2. And the first, sorry, I just think things sometimes. Anyway, so the first couple of chapters, Jesus is he's talking to John, the apostle. Jesus has already been raised from the dead. He's in heaven, and so he visits John. John kind of has this vision, and he's sharing with John, I want you to write a letter to these 7 churches. John was the apostle of love, and yet in these letters, there's some good things that they do, and of the 7 churches, there are 5 churches that he deals with some correction. There are 2 churches in there that there wasn't any correction in there. And so one of the churches that he's writing to, and I'm sure I'm murdering the name of this, is a church called Thyatira. Now, Thyatira is mentioned in the book of Acts. There was a lady named Lydia that was from Thyatira. She got saved. She was a businesswoman, became a Christian. And so she was a huge part of the church in, I think, Philippi. And so Jesus is giving instructions to this church in Thyatira, and it starts out in Revelation chapter 2, verse 19. Jesus said this, he said, I know all the things you do. So one of the things that he said to each one of the churches is, that I see what you do. In other words, and what that literally means, it's like he was walking among them, looking in their lives, knowing what's going on with them personally, knowing also what's going on in the church. He was not indifferent to that or unaware of that. And as he starts out this letter, each one of these letters, he refers to these churches as a lampstand or a candlestick. And they were all in his presence. And I think one of the reasons is because when those candles were in his presence and they were lit, they revealed who Jesus is. And I think that's what the church's job is, to reveal to the world who Jesus is. But if they got off into disobedience for any period of time, as time went on, their candlestick would move further away from him. And at some point, they got to a place that they were no longer revealing who he is. And so that was the warning he was giving them, like, don't stray so far that you quit revealing me. And so he's saying to this church right here, this church in Thyatira, he said, I know all the things you do. I've seen your love, your faith, your service, and your patient endurance. Those are good things, right? He looks at me and goes, I see how you guys love each other. I see your faith in the way that you trust me, even in the hard times. I see how patient and how enduring you are in what's going on. And so he said, I see all of that, and I can see your constant improvement in all these things. Which you guys are growing in these areas. That's really good. But then he said, but I have this complaint against you. So he said, you guys do all these things, right? But when I'm walking among you, I've noticed this. I have this complaint against you, that you are permitting that woman, that Jezebel, who calls herself a prophet, to lead my servants astray. She teaches them to commit sexual sin and to eat food offered to idols. I gave her time. Everybody say time. I gave her time to repent, but she does not want to turn away from her immorality. Therefore, I will throw her on a bed of suffering, and those who commit adultery with her will suffer greatly unless they repent and turn away from her evil deeds. Now, when he used the name Jezebel, we don't believe that that was literally this woman's name. Jezebel was a lady in the Old Testament that she was a queen that was from another area that didn't worship the God that we worship. She was like a Baal worshiper, and she married Ahab, who was a king, the earthly king of God's people, and she led him astray along with the rest of the nation. And so Jesus was saying that this lady is just like her. And so what was happening back then is that a lot of the churches were suffering persecution, but really historically, we don't see a ton of persecution recorded regarding Thyatira. It was actually a place that had a lot of business in it. There were a lot of people that did metalworks and different things like that. A lot of commerce took place in this area. And so one of the things that happened is that before Christianity showed up, there was this huge pagan influence in this area. And if you worked there, if you had a business, they had these things. They were almost like unions. They were kind of laborers' guilds that you would join and become a part of, but they weren't secular in nature. They were connected to these pagan temples and pagan worship, and each line of business had its own pagan god that they would pay homage to. And if you wanted to do business there, you had to join one of these guilds that were connected to this pagan god, and then they would show up and they would do these rituals that were very sexual in nature, and so there was a lot of sexual immorality that was taking place. So people get saved, become Christians, and one of the things is our lives begin to turn around. We begin to lay those things down, and we know what God has called us. He's called us to be pure in this area of our life. And so they were faced with this challenge like, man, if I'm going to be a Christian, if I'm going to walk as a Christ follower and not commit these things anymore, that means I'm going to have to pull away from this guild, which could really cost me my business. Well, all of a sudden, this lady rose up in the church, and she began to say, it's okay. You go ahead and do that. It's okay. God understands. He understands. You go ahead and do that. You stay connected to those pagan things, to those orgy-like things. You stay connected to that. And Jesus was like, I'm not okay with that. I'm not okay with that. And he said, in dealing with this woman, here's the goodness of God. It says, I gave her time to repent. And to me, it almost implies as he's writing this letter that she still has time. This is part of his patience. Like, send this letter out, man. Like, if she reads it and repents, it can change. But he gave her time. And then he said this about her. It wasn't like this was something that she struggled with. It wasn't like she looked and goes, man, I'm really struggling with this, and I know it's wrong, and I want to do better. And God's so patient with it. But with this, she was like, I gave her time to repent, but she does not want to turn away from her immorality. In other words, she's like, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm going to live how I want to live. He said, okay. See, I think that the thing that we miss so often is that God hates sin, not us, sin. He hates sin because he knows sin has this judgment built into it. And that sin, it just brings about destruction in our lives. I know for me that when if he looks at my marriage, that anytime that selfishness shows up, he hates that selfishness because he knows that it can affect mine and Tina's marriage. That anytime that unforgiveness shows up, he hates that because he knows that that'll just build walls between us and create things. That he wants me to stay connected to her and her only sexually, because if that gets broken up, it affects us. So he looks at each one of these things in our lives and he's like, man, don't do that. That's going to affect you. And so he wants us to get to a place where we see these things in our lives and we're like, Lord, I'm not okay with this. Help me to do right. This lady right here, she was like, I don't care. I'm going to do what I want to do. And there's something about that attitude and that mindset that pushes us towards judgment in our life, pushes us towards brokenness in our lives, pushes us towards pain and just destruction in our life. That's what sin, it does to us. It affects us. How many of you have ever heard of Samson and Delilah? Heard about them? Remember Samson got a bad haircut, ruined his life? I mean, it's one of those things. I identify with him. And so here's the thing, is that there's more to it than that. Actually, he got in... Anyway, he got involved with this lady that he shouldn't have got involved with. And we look at that and we're like, oh man, but the truth of the matter is that that had happened in his life more than once. It happened in his life more than once. And so all these things took place. And here's the challenge we have with God's patience, all right? To understand this, number two is this, is that God's patience is not a sign of his approval. That in his patience, that he's being patient with me, that he's kind of holding back this attitude, the consequences, that this mindset of I'm going to do what I want to do. He's kind of holding back the consequences of that as long as there's hope, as long as he can. Because if we continue in that direction, that hard-heartedness, that I'm going to do what I want, that brings a destruction in our life. And think about this, especially those of you that are parents, you get this. That you see your kids making decisions that like grieve you or anger you, not because you're mad at them, but you know where they keep going this direction, where it will take them. This lady at any time could have said, you know what, that's not okay. Lord, I'm sorry. And it would turn the course of her life. And again, even God in his goodness, Jesus is like, I'm giving her time. Some people have this picture of God that, oh, you blew it, okay. As opposed to him pleading with her, dealing with her, stop this. And then even writing this letter, hey, I mean, they probably knew who he was talking about. This very public correction, this very, very public confrontation. Her response was, she does not want to turn away from her immorality. Her response was, I'm going to do what I want. You're going to tell me what to do. I'm going to do this. And it brought about this judgment in her life. It brought about these things. And the thing that we have to understand is just like parents can be patient with their children, when we're patient with our kids, it's not us saying, well, it's okay. It's us correcting them and giving them time to grow and doing the things, but sometimes the correction has to be difficult, almost hard in its response. But it's given in order to bring about real change in our lives. And so I have to remind myself, because God, he's been so patient with me. I have to remind myself that sometimes in those moments, it's like, this is not him saying, I'm okay with this. Matter of fact, when I remember that, then it brings about conviction where I'm like, Lord, I don't want to do this anymore. And even if I do struggle with it, I need you to help me get free from it, as opposed to, I'm going to do what I want to do. I don't want to take advantage of his patience, of his goodness towards me. I've said this before, that sometimes we say that God is love, and we treat that he loves us so he's indifferent to what we do. And what other relationship is it that way? I love my kids, and so it matters to me the decisions they make. I love my wife, so I care about the choices she makes. He loves me. So he's aware of what I'm doing and the decisions I make, and he wants to deal with my life. Not because he's angry, not because he's a prude, but because he's a good father, and he knows that these decisions will bring about destruction in my world. That's what he does. He's patient, but that is in no way him saying, this is okay. He's trying to point out this lady that at some point you go in this direction is going to bring about destruction in your world. Number two, God's patience is not a sign of his approval. Let's look at number three, and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to 2 Peter 3. It's just a few books before Revelation. 2 Peter 3, verse 3. Now, this is not going to surprise you. 2 Peter was written by a guy by the name of Peter. And so he was one of the apostles, one of the chief apostles of Jesus. And he was a guy I identify with. I've said this before. He was a guy, sometimes he was talking when he should have been listening, acting when he should have been sitting still and that kind of thing. But yet he's writing this letter. His story's been so changed by his encounter with Jesus that he's writing this letter in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 3. He says, most importantly, I want to remind you that in the last days, scoffers will come mocking the truth and following their own desires. They will say, what happened to the promise that Jesus is coming again? From before the times of our ancestors, everything has remained the same since the world was first created. They deliberately forget that God made the heavens long ago by the word of his command. And he brought the earth out from the water and surrounded it with water. Then he used the water to destroy the ancient world with a mighty flood. And by the same word, the present heavens and earth have been stored up for fire. They're being kept for the day of judgment when the godly people will be destroyed. But you must not forget this one thing, dear friends. A day is like 1,000 years to the Lord, and 1,000 years is like a day. Now listen to this. The Lord isn't really being slow about his promise as some people think. No, he's being patient. Everybody say patient. For your sake. He's being patient for your sake, for my sake. He's being patient. He does not want anyone to be destroyed, but wants everyone to repent. So this is what Peter was saying, is that in the early church, they mentioned this a lot, and we've kind of gotten away from it and need to get back. They talked a lot about the fact that Jesus is coming back, and he is coming back. He is returning. He's going to come back to the earth someday. And it's, man, as a Christian, it's going to be a great time if you're still alive on the earth, that when that happens and you'll be restored with people that are in heaven, there'll be this great reunion. You know, it's just going to be the coolest thing. You're like, will we know each other? Man, you will. You'll know each other. You'll share memories together. And just, it's a family. It's just a great thing. And so it'll be this great moment. But they talked about that often, and we don't talk about it nearly as much. But he said this, he said, in the last days, people will begin to say, y'all have been saying that a long time. You've been saying that forever, that Jesus is going to come back. And, you know, nothing's changed. Things are just like they were. He's not coming back. You guys keep saying, they said, scoffers will say that. Are we in the last days? Are they saying that? Yeah, absolutely. But he said, don't be misled by that. Understand this, that the reason why he hasn't come back yet, the reason why it's taken what seems like so long to us, even though it's not long to God, so long to us, is because he's patient, waiting on people that haven't turned to him yet to turn to him. He's just so patient. Jesus compared it to a person, to a shepherd that had lost a sheep, and that the shepherd pursues the lost sheep. He compared it to a person that had lost a coin, that the person who lost a coin pursues that lost coin. He compared it to a father who's got a son that's distanced himself and left everything that he knew to be true, that stood on the porchway every day and looked at the road, looked at the field to see if today was the day that his son was coming home. That Jesus was revealing the heart of God to people in this way. And one of the reasons why he is so patient, one of the reasons why he's so patient with us, is because so more people will come to know him. Man, when I was young, it was one of those things that I would pray the sinner's prayer. One of the reasons why at the end we give people a chance to respond for assurance, because I was that guy for the longest time. I was like, well, I know I prayed this prayer like 37 or 38 times, but I want to make sure, And it was almost like I had this mindset that maybe on a good day that I'm finally going to catch the day and God's going to be like, okay, I'll save you today. I mean, that was kind of the mindset that I had, as opposed to understanding that God's not looking for a way to eliminate me. He sent Jesus so I could have access to him. And so when I make Jesus the Lord of my life, in that moment, I become a child of God. Because that's his great desire. That was a good day for me, but it was a good day for him too. He even said this, Jesus said this, that heaven throws a party when people get saved. You probably got relatives, the day you got saved, there were people up there high-fiving like, woo, man, did you see that? That was my granddaughter down there. That's my grandson. They got saved, and people said they would never get saved. I mean, they're just celebrating, hugging, high-fiving, fist bumping. I mean, whatever it is, however they probably, it's probably so much better. Anyway, so it's just one of those things that God gets excited about that, and that's why he's patient. He's waiting on that. One story I shared with you is several years ago, we had a young lady that went to church here, and she was a high school student, and her grandfather, who'd been healthy as a horse, just one day shows up sick. And so for a few months, they treat him, but they just realized he didn't have much time left. I remember spending some time with him in the hospital room, and he had not given his life to Jesus, and he was such a good man. He loved his family, he loved his daughter and his son-in-law, and he loved his granddaughter who was there with us. And I just said, how come you haven't done this yet? And he said, when I was little, and my dad passed away kind of unexpectedly, that the minister, that when he talked with me, he said, well, your dad's probably not in heaven or anything like that. And I'm like, man, just telling a kid that. And the truth of the matter is that you don't know what state somebody was in when they left this earth. He may have gotten right with God. You just don't know. So for years, he'd resisted the conviction of God just because he was like, what he'd heard about his dad. And I took to him, I said, I don't know where your dad is. It's not for me to say. I don't know what happened in the last minutes of your dad's life. But we can do something about your last minutes. And I said, you've dealt with this for the rest of your life. Do you love your daughter? Yes. You love your granddaughter, Cheryl, more than anything. I said, do you want her to live with those same thoughts? He said, no. And I remember her 17-year-old self got up, and she went over and she crawled in the hospital bed with him. She told him she loved him. I said, what? Do you want to pray and do this right now and settle this? And he goes, yes. And so we prayed. And I thought about the goodness of God that for years saw this boy carry this wound in his heart for decades. That in this moment he has this encounter with the goodness of God. And he's restored. A few weeks ago, somebody goes to church here, their grandfather was on the deathbed, and they called me and they said, I don't know if he's right or not. Would you go see him? And I said, sure. So I went to the nursing home. And we talked about the relationship with God. And I said, let's just pray and settle this. And he goes, okay. So I prayed, and he repeated after me. I led him in this prayer. And this past week, I got to do the funeral, but I was able to do it with the confidence that I don't know what kind of life he'd had up till that time, but I know because I prayed with him that day. I saw him surrender his life to Jesus. And I saw the grace of God way to come to this broken life to catch up. Now, that wasn't God's best. It'd been so much better if he'd have done that earlier, but the patience of God to wait for that moment. Will everybody get that? No. But in this guy's life, he just waited. I think about the thieves on the cross when Jesus was crucified. And it says on either side of him were guys that were thieves. In other words, their identity was the same, and yet their outcome was different because one of them, it says, mocked him. When he had an encounter with Jesus, he turned away from him. But the other, when he had this encounter with Jesus, he said to him, he said, hey, remember me when you go into your kingdom. And Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. And even though their stories were the same up until that moment because of his response to the encounter of Jesus the last day of his life, his story was impacted. And I see the patience of God even in this dark moment of this guy restoring his story. When I look at the patience of God, I start in my own life, and I'm amazed by it. I'm overwhelmed by it. I'm overcome by it. I know how patient he's been with me. I've had the privilege of encountering it with other people in their lives, that as their lives come to an end, and sometimes that we're fortunate enough to have that conversation, just kind of settle things. That I leave that place with the patience of God, and I'm just so grateful with how patient he's been throughout their story. And it causes me to want to be more committed to him. It causes me to want to be less selfish. It causes me to want to hear his voice better, respond better, not hang on to what I want, but to let my life change because I realize how good he is. God's patient so more people will come to know him. Jesus continued to wait because he wants as many people with him as possible. That's such a different picture than so many people have of him. That he wants people that give their lives to Jesus, as many as can, to have that recognition, and so that's why he waits. That's why he waits. It brings about change in my life. I want to do this. I want us to bow our heads and close our